To wrap up this semester and this series of videos on environmental science, I wanted to take some time to talk about the history of environmental science and important environmental laws and the idea of environmental economics and environmental justice. I am not an expert in any of these fields, but I want to give a little context to the thought behind environmental science and environmentalism. Environmentalism and the concept of environmental protection in the United States is relatively new. Sorry, let me rephrase that. Environmentalism and the concept of environmental protection was ingrained in the traditions and practices of Native Americans for thousands of years. They understood, and still understand, that nature is precious and many resources are limited and non-renewable. That is the job of humans to be stewards of the land. However, when Europeans arrived in the early 1600s, they brought with them the idea that natural resources, particularly North America, were inexhaustible and theirs for the taking, no matter who currently lived there. This frontier attitude caused the widespread destruction of the environment in what would become the United States, including the death and displacement of Native Americans. By the late 1700s and 1800s, men like John James Audubon and Henry David Thoreau painted and wrote about nature, making it a place to be in harmony with, not a place to dominate and destroy. While this was an important and positive move towards a more environmentalist ideal, it is important to note that these men were concerned with nature as a place for the wealthy and for the privileged, not a place for Native Americans or other marginalized groups. However, the current Audubon Society takes great care to protect the environment in an inclusive and thoughtful way. The environmental ideal also came to the United States government in the 1890s, with the establishment of Yosemite and Sequoia National Parks, and the formation of the U.S. Forest Service. Much of the early environmental ideal can be split into two camps, the Utilitarian Conservationists and the Biocentric Preservationists. Utilitarian conservationists value natural resources for their use and understand that they should be protected and managed for future use. Biocentric preservationists, on the other hand, protect nature for nature's sake. Famous utilitarian conservationists were President Theodore Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot, the first head of the U.S. Forest Service. The most famous biocentric preservationist was John Muir, who founded the Sierra Club and pushed for the formation of many of the national parks. However, both of these ideals are couched in the ideas born of the frontier attitude, that these places should be conserved for those they saw as regular Americans, or more specifically, those who were or were descended from white European settlers. Indeed, many of the Native Americans who lived in or near the land where parks were to be constructed were forcibly removed and were no longer allowed to hunt or fish within the parks. Thankfully, there has been a, albeit slow, shift in attitude, and more Native voices, perspectives, traditions, and beliefs are being considered in the management and protection of nature around the U.S. Modern environmentalism can trace its origin back to an aquatic biologist by the name of Rachel Carson. Her popular scientific novel, Silent Spring, about the impact of pollution and pesticides on drinking water, food supplies, and wildlife made many aware of environmental issues and the importance of protecting the environment. The book, published in 1962, was the catalyst for environmental activism and eventually environmental laws into the 1970s and beyond. The first Earth Day was celebrated in 1970 and has been a yearly tradition of recognizing the importance of the planet and its limited and precious resources. In that same year, the Environmental Protection Agency was formed as the leading governmental body tasked with the protection of the nation's natural resources and the health of the environment, including drinking water and air. Many laws have been passed since the establishment of the EPA, including laws related to clean air and clean water, energy conservation and proper disposal and cleanup of hazardous waste, the regulation of pesticide use, and the regulation of carbon dioxide and other pollutants. While activism and laws are important to change people's behavior and thoughts about the environment, there is still much to be done. For example, environmental economics aim to use the properties of the market to increase environmental awareness and increase environmental protection. To them, environmental issues are caused by failures in the market due to two things. One, externalities. These are the costs of production that are not paid for by the producer. These includes things like air and water pollution. The impacts of these are instead paid by people who live in the areas affected, or they can even be spread out to all of society. For example, the impacts of climate change. The second is inefficiencies. Resources are not used well, and energy and materials and other resources are wasted, possibly becoming pollution. A concept to deal with both is the concept of the ecosystem service. An ecosystem service is something like clean water that is provided from nature to humans free of charge. Pollution and land degradation reduce the ability of ecosystems to provide these services, and therefore, the value of the ecosystem decreases. If the cost of losing those services were factored into corporate expenses and could jeopardize profits, those corporations might start to better consider externalities and inefficiencies. However, while this concept works well on paper, it is difficult to assess the true cost of environmental degradation and also to assign values to ecosystem services which intrinsically have no monetary value. A huge consideration in modern environmentalism that was sorely missed in the conservation movements of the 18 and early 1900s is the concept of environmental justice. This is the right of every citizen, regardless of age, race, gender, social class, or any other factor, to adequate protection from environmental hazards and equal and equitable access to nature. Low-income and minority communities tend to face more environmental threats and have access to fewer amenities. They also have traditionally had less voice in planning. The fact that the establishment of much of the groundwork for the environmental protection in the U.S. was done without, or sometimes in direct conflict with, the perspective and the needs of Native Americans is a travesty. It is the challenge of environmental justice to find equitable solutions to environmental issues that respect all groups of people and does not discriminate based on wealth or skin color.